A child disappears from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. No screams, no signs of struggle, just silence. What followed was a manhunt, a shocking betrayal of trust, and a secret buried in the desert. This is the haunting case that shattered a neighborhood and gripped a nation. The early morning of February 2, 2002, began like any other in the peaceful suburb of Sabre Springs, San Diego. But inside the Van Dam household, panic had begun to swell. Brenda Van Dam walked into her daughter's room expecting to find 7-year-old Danielle still curled beneath the covers. Instead, the bed was empty, undisturbed. The house was silent. A sense of dread crept in, as she and her husband Damon searched room to room, calling her name, hoping for a misplaced blanket fort, a sleepover with a sibling, some innocent explanation. None came. Within minutes, they called 911. Police arrived quickly and began their initial sweep. No broken windows, no forced entry, no screams had been heard in the night. The only anomaly: a sliding glass door had been left unlocked. It was a subtle detail, easy to overlook in the chaos of a busy household, but now it loomed large. The Van Dams recounted their evening to investigators. Brenda had been out with friends that Friday night while Damon stayed home with the kids. She returned in the early morning hours. They had checked on the children briefly, then gone to bed. Danielle had already been taken. The investigation launched at full speed. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood while crime scene teams combed through the home. Flyers were printed, helicopters deployed, and bloodhounds brought in to pick up any scent trail they could. Hundreds of community volunteers joined law enforcement, spreading out through canyons, cul-de-sacs, and nearby parks. The entire city of San Diego seemed to hold its breath, desperate to find a trace of the missing child. News outlets quickly picked up the story, and soon Danielle's photograph, brown-haired, gap-toothed, beaming, was on every television screen in California. With each passing day, the case grew more troubling. There was no ransom demand, no communication from a kidnapper, no evidence suggesting that Danielle had run away. Investigators expanded their reach and began looking closely at everyone connected to the Van Dam family. Friends, relatives, and neighbors. The house became the epicenter of national media attention, and as the family struggled to maintain hope, rumors and speculation began to circulate. Some scrutinized the parents' social lives, noting their participation in adult-themed gatherings. Others questioned whether the unlocked door had truly been forgotten or if it was part of a larger story. Then came a breakthrough, not from the house but from 2 doors down. David Westerfield, a 50-year-old self-employed engineer, had been seen leaving the neighborhood early on the morning Danielle was reported missing. His movements stood out. He claimed to have taken a solo trip in his motorhome to the desert that same day, returning a few days later. When questioned, he appeared anxious, inconsistent. He said he hadn't seen Danielle in months. But investigators were skeptical. They requested access to his home, his motorhome, and his vehicles. He complied. What they found began to shift the entire focus of the investigation. Inside Westerfield's motorhome, police discovered traces of long, brown hair. Fibers, too, that resembled those from Danielle's clothing. Items were sent to forensic labs for DNA testing. Meanwhile, his behavior became even more suspect. As the city rallied around the Van Dams and their tireless search for Danielle, Westerfield stayed out of sight. He hired a lawyer. He gave no interviews. To the public, he became the quiet, odd neighbor who had left town just hours after a child went missing, and now couldn't explain why her DNA might be inside his RV. The Van Dams, still reeling from Danielle's disappearance, had no choice but to brace themselves for what was coming. Law enforcement had not officially named Westerfield a suspect, but his name had begun to circulate. The community's frustration grew. Parents clutched their children tighter. Strangers pointed fingers. The Van Dams faced relentless questions about their own habits and the media's scrutiny of their lives, while their daughter remained missing, was unrelenting. Days turned into weeks. Despite increasing circumstantial evidence, police still lacked the definitive proof they needed. Then, after 25 days of searching, came the discovery that would end the waiting. and ignite a wave of heartbreak. On February 27th, a search volunteer stumbled across a child's body partially buried along a remote roadside in Dehesa, a rural area east of San Diego. The remains were badly decomposed. It was Danielle. The medical examiner could not determine an exact cause of death due to the condition of the body. The silence surrounding her final moments remained. But the location and timing fit the narrative investigators had been quietly building. With Danielle's recovery, the case shifted dramatically. Now, it wasn't just about finding a missing child, it was about solving a murder. The evidence collected from Westerfield's property was re-examined with greater urgency. Lab results confirmed that the hair found in the RV belonged to Danielle. Fibers from her pajamas were present in his home. Even more damning, a drop of her blood had been discovered on one of his jackets, tucked away in his laundry. Westerfield was arrested and charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. The public finally had a name, a face, and someone to direct their fury toward. For the Van Dam family, the moment offered some measure of direction. Justice now had a path forward, but it did not ease their grief. Their daughter was still gone, and the answers to what had happened to her in those final hours or days remained locked inside the man now sitting in a cell. As Westerfield prepared to stand trial, a mountain of forensic evidence was compiled against him. His team began assembling a defense that would try to explain away what science could not. But for the city of San Diego, the trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with the terrifying truth that someone living in plain sight, in a quiet suburban street, could abduct and murder a child without a sound. And that even behind the most normal-looking doors, darkness might be hiding. The search for Danielle had ended. But the search for justice, true, undeniable justice, had only just begun. As David Westerfield sat in a jail cell, the legal machine began to grind forward with fierce determination. Prosecutors worked tirelessly to build their case, knowing the eyes of the nation were watching. Public pressure was immense, and for the Van Dam family, every court date reopened fresh wounds. Though Danielle's body had been found, the circumstances of her final hours remained hidden behind Westerfield's cold demeanor and refusal to speak. He showed no remorse, offered no confession. What remained was a case built on forensics, timelines, and contradictions. Every detail was going to matter. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on science. DNA analysis had advanced significantly by 2002, and forensic experts were ready to testify with confidence. Blood from Danielle was confirmed on Westerfield's jacket. Fibers from her bedding were matched to materials in his motorhome, and fingerprints, too small to deny, had been lifted from inside his RV. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Danielle had been in his home and vehicle, despite his adamant denial. Westerfield had told detectives he hadn't seen her in weeks, but the data told another story. The hairs found in his bedding, carpets, and clothing aligned precisely with those from Danielle's brush. It was evidence that didn't just suggest contact, it proved it. Beyond forensics, the timeline also betrayed him. He claimed to have left on a spontaneous trip the morning Danielle was discovered missing. But surveillance and witness statements placed him in areas where he shouldn't have been. His story shifted under questioning. He said he'd gone to the desert, then later changed it to the beach, then back to the desert again. He claimed to have gotten stuck in the sand, yet no one saw him there. No gas receipts, no motel records. Investigators concluded that his journey was not spontaneous at all, but an attempt to flee scrutiny and potentially dispose of damning evidence. The trial began on June 4, 2002. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Journalists packed the benches. Members of the public stood in line for hours hoping for seats. On one side sat Brenda and Damon Van Dam, their grief still raw. On the other, Westerfield, calm and emotionless, dressed in suits each day, his legal team close behind. The prosecution wasted no time presenting its arsenal. Microscopic fibers, blood samples, hair strands, fingerprints. Every piece pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Danielle had been in Westerfield's custody, likely for days, before her life was taken and her body discarded in the wilderness. The defense took a different path, trying to deflect suspicion by focusing on the Van Dam's lifestyle. They raised questions about Brenda and Damon's parenting, about guests in their home that night, about rumors of marijuana use and open marriage. The strategy was clear. Cast just enough doubt to make the jury wonder if someone else might have had access to the house. But the tactic drew criticism. The public saw it as character assassination of grieving parents. And in court, it failed to challenge the solid weight of forensic evidence. Still, the trial was not without complexity. The medical examiner couldn't establish a precise cause or time of death due to decomposition. This gave the defense a sliver of opportunity. They suggested that Danielle may have died shortly after being taken, or even later during the height of the search, implying that the real killer may have used the media frenzy as a shield. But the argument didn't hold up under scrutiny. Entomologists were brought in to study insect activity on the remains and narrowed the timeline, reinforcing that Danielle had likely died early in her disappearance, consistent with Westerfield's unaccounted time alone in the desert. Witnesses were called one by one. A dry cleaner testified that Westerfield had brought in several garments, including the now infamous jacket, just days after Danielle vanished. Crime lab analysts detailed how DNA was extracted and how contamination was ruled out. A neighbor remembered Westerfield backing his RV into his driveway awkwardly, as though trying to shield it from view. A young girl, similar in age to Danielle, testified that Westerfield had once approached her at school with an uncomfortable level of interest. Piece by piece, the prosecution assembled a chilling narrative. Westerfield was not just the only suspect. He was the only logical explanation. Emotion hung heavy in the courtroom when Brenda Van Dam took the stand. She described the morning Danielle went missing, her daughter's room, the feeling that something terrible had entered their home unnoticed. Her voice trembled, but she was clear and firm. Damon followed with his own testimony, holding back tears as he recalled the desperation of those first few hours and the horror of learning how Danielle was found. The jury watched closely. These weren't just grieving parents. They were witnesses to a nightmare that had unfolded in real time. Westerfield never testified. His lawyers feared cross-examination would unravel any remaining credibility. Instead, he sat motionless as testimony after testimony closed in around him. The jury deliberated for 10 days, longer than expected. It was clear they understood the gravity of their decision. This wasn't just a question of guilt. It was a decision about life or death. Finally, on August 21, 2002, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, murder with special circumstances, and possession of child pornography, a revelation quietly included in the trial but never front and center. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs. The Van Dams embraced, eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and relief. Justice, after months of agony, had come. But it came with the knowledge that their daughter's life had been taken in the most senseless, brutal way. The courtroom's silence broke as the jury announced David Westerfield's guilt, a verdict that echoed across San Diego and far beyond. Brenda and Damon Van Dam wept quietly, holding each other, surrounded by the crushing finality that justice had been served, but at an unbearable cost. Westerfield showed no emotion, no regret, only the stiff stillness of a man who knew the weight of the decision had sealed his fate. For weeks, jurors had studied gruesome photographs, analyzed forensic evidence, and listened to hours of testimony. Their verdict was not rushed. It was deliberate, considered, and ultimately decisive. But the story didn't end there. Following the guilty verdict, the court reconvened for the penalty phase, a crucial step in determining whether Westerfield would receive life in prison without parole or be sentenced to death. This portion of the trial brought a deeper emotional intensity. Jurors who had already endured the harrowing details of the case now faced the most severe decision a civilian panel could make. The prosecution argued that the circumstances were beyond heinous. A child, taken from her bed, hidden away, murdered, and discarded in the desert. They emphasized the calculated effort Westerfield made to cover his tracks, his lack of remorse, and the fact that he never offered an explanation, not even a plea for leniency. The defense, now with their options exhausted, shifted tone. They presented witnesses who spoke of Westerfield's intelligence, his contributions as an engineer, and his lack of prior criminal history. Family members painted a picture of a quiet, reclusive man who had spiraled into darkness. Not a lifelong predator. But these testimonies, while heartfelt, felt too distant from the violence of the crime. The prosecution reminded the jury that none of these character references could erase what Westerfield had done to Danielle or what her family had endured since that February morning. Brenda Van Dam took the stand again. This time, her words were not just to inform, they were to remind. She described how every part of their lives had changed, how her son had nightmares, how Danielle's room remained untouched, a place of frozen time. She did not demand vengeance, but she pleaded for justice that reflected the magnitude of their loss. Her voice cracked when she spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, a future daughter who would never grow up, fall in love, or chase dreams. Her grief filled the courtroom like a second presence. On September 16, 2002, the jury returned again. David Westerfield was sentenced to death. It was the ultimate penalty, rarely handed down in California, but this case, jurors later said, left them with no other choice. The judge echoed their decision, stating that Westerfield's actions reflected an utter disregard for human life. The Van Dam family felt a bittersweet form of closure. Justice, yes, but the hole in their lives could never be filled. The execution would not be swift. In California, death sentences are followed by years of appeals and delays, and in the meantime, Westerfield would be housed in San Quentin State Prison, among the most notorious death row populations in the country. After the trial, the community of Sabre Springs slowly tried to heal. Shrines of teddy bears and candles had once filled the neighborhood sidewalks, a vivid reminder of the horror they'd all lived through. Now those were replaced with silence and solemn reflection. But Danielle's memory lived on. The Van Dams, though devastated, chose to become advocates. They pushed for child protection laws, lending their voices to campaigns aimed at preventing future tragedies. Their advocacy contributed to new discussions in the California legislature, including the enhancement of sex offender monitoring, rapid response protocols in missing child cases, and strengthening the Amber Alert system. Out of the darkness, they tried to build something meaningful, something that could save others. The impact of Danielle's case rippled across media and policy. Talk shows and news outlets dissected every detail. The public had followed the case from the moment of her disappearance through the agonizing search and into the courtroom. For many, Danielle became the symbol of lost innocence. Her image, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with freckles and a wide smile, was burned into the collective memory. The name Danielle Van Dam was no longer just the story of one child. It was a call to action. In the years that followed, Westerfield remained behind bars, appealing his sentence through every legal channel available. His attorneys challenged the handling of evidence, the admissibility of certain testimonies, and even the jury selection process. None of the appeals brought relief. The evidence was too strong, the jury too certain. Westerfield never confessed. Not once did he provide the Van Dams with an explanation, an apology, or even an acknowledgement of his actions. To this day, the motive behind Danielle's abduction and murder remains a mystery. He took not only her life but also the truth of what happened during those final silent hours. Despite the passage of time, the pain has not faded. Every February, the Van Dam family marks the anniversary of their daughter's disappearance with quiet remembrance. Close friends, community members, and child safety advocates join them, not just in mourning, but in reaffirming the value of vigilance and awareness. They continue to speak at events and support organizations that protect vulnerable children. What happened to Danielle Van Dam was unspeakable, but through tireless advocacy, her legacy became one of prevention and reform. For many, this case remains among the most haunting in modern California history, not simply because of its brutality, but because of how ordinary the setting was. A safe neighborhood, a loving family, a quiet street, and just 2 doors down, a monster no one saw coming. The lessons from Danielle's story are both devastating and necessary. They remind us that evil doesn't always come with warning signs, and that trust, once violated, leaves scars that never truly heal. David Westerfield remains on death row. The Van Dam family continues to live with the loss, their lives forever divided into before and after. But Danielle's memory endures, not only in the minds of those who loved her, but also in the changes sparked by her story. She was a little girl who loved dancing, sleepovers, and the color purple. And though her life was taken far too soon, the world remembers her, not as a victim, but as a child whose legacy helped change the course of justice and child safety in America. On Christmas Eve, a pregnant woman vanished without a trace. Her husband had an alibi, a smile, and a secret lover. As the nation searched for answers, a horrifying truth began to surface. What really happened to Laci Peterson, and how far would one man go to escape his perfect life? On the morning of December 24, 2002, Modesto, California stirred quietly, wrapped in the holiday calm of Christmas Eve. Families were busy preparing meals, finishing last-minute shopping, and soaking in the comfort of familiar traditions. At 523 Covina Avenue, the home of Scott and Laci Peterson appeared no different. The couple had recently moved into the neighborhood and were expecting their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. Laci, 8 months pregnant, was described as joyful and glowing. She was deeply engaged in planning for the baby's arrival and excited about the upcoming family dinner at her parents' house later that evening. By all appearances, life in the Peterson household was peaceful. But within hours, that calm would be shattered, and what began as a routine holiday morning would spiral into one of the most chilling criminal investigations in American history. Scott Peterson claimed he left their home that morning around 9:30 a.m. to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, more than 90 miles away. He said Laci was planning to walk their golden retriever, Mackenzie, and prepare for the evening's dinner with her mother. When Scott returned home that afternoon, Laci was gone. The dog was found wandering the neighborhood with its leash still on. Concerned but calm, Scott called his mother-in-law to check if Laci had arrived early. She hadn't. Panic slowly crept in as family members arrived and began calling hospitals, friends, and neighbors. By that evening, Laci was officially reported missing to the Modesto Police Department. The disappearance of a pregnant woman just hours before Christmas gripped the local community almost instantly. Flyers with Laci's photograph spread through the town like wildfire. Volunteers gathered by the dozens, forming search parties and combing through fields, parks, and nearby waterways. Candlelight vigils were held nightly as the town held its breath, hoping for good news. The media caught wind of the story, and soon national networks were broadcasting live from Modesto. The nation became emotionally invested in the missing woman with the kind smile and round belly, whose husband appeared daily beside her grieving family, appealing tearfully for her safe return. However, behind the scenes, detectives began to notice subtle cracks in the surface. While Scott appeared cooperative and calm, his demeanor struck investigators as oddly detached. He seemed too composed for a man whose wife and unborn child had vanished. He gave long interviews and consented to searches but often avoided direct emotional expressions. The media picked up on this too. Armchair detectives and viewers watching from across the country began to question what was really going on inside the Peterson home. As the days stretched into weeks, no substantial leads emerged. There was no sign of struggle in the house, no break-in, no evidence that Laci had left voluntarily. Her wallet, keys, and phone were still in the home. Her car remained parked in the driveway. The only trace of her that had left the house that morning was the dog, found wandering without its pregnant owner. Scott's fishing trip also began to draw suspicion. Investigators couldn't understand why he would drive all the way to the Berkeley Marina on a cold December morning for a solo fishing outing on Christmas Eve. His route was long and seemingly unnecessary. Adding to the uncertainty was the nature of the fishing itself. Scott had brought only one small lure and a newly purchased boat he'd barely used before. He said he caught nothing and returned home by late afternoon. The first major break in the case came not from forensic evidence, but from a phone call. On January 24, 2003, exactly 1 month after Laci disappeared, a woman named Amber Fry came forward to the police. A single mother and massage therapist from Fresno, Amber revealed that she had been dating Scott Peterson in the weeks leading up to Laci's disappearance. She had believed he was single. In fact, on December 9th, Just 2 weeks before Christmas, Scott had told her during a romantic dinner that he had lost his wife, and that this would be his first Christmas without her. He said it with such solemnity, Amber recalled, that she had comforted him, unaware that Lacey was alive and well at that very moment. Amber's revelation shifted the entire narrative. What had once seemed like a tragic disappearance now smelled of betrayal. The public's view of Scott Peterson turned swiftly. The man who stood beside tearful family members was now exposed as a liar who had actively concealed his extramarital affair during a crisis. Public sympathy turned to outrage. Amber, devastated by the truth, agreed to help investigators. With her consent, police recorded dozens of phone conversations between her and Scott. In these calls, Scott continued to lie, even as search parties still scoured the countryside for Lacey. Detectives now turned their focus intensely on Scott. They began scrutinizing his finances, phone records, and movements in the days before and after Lacey's disappearance. What they found were strange inconsistencies, changing stories, odd behavior, and a pattern of deceit. Scott's emotions remained flat, his tone distant, even as his wife's face was on every television screen in the country. Though he maintained his innocence and continued to cooperate publicly, police sensed a calculated performance. And though no direct evidence yet tied him to foul play, suspicion had taken deep root. By early spring, the case remained officially unsolved. Yet it was no longer a mystery to those watching closely. The question was no longer whether Lacey had met with harm, but who was responsible. The hope of finding her alive had grown dim. Search efforts shifted focus. Helicopters began scanning the San Francisco Bay. Divers were deployed to investigate murky waters. Cadaver dogs were brought in along the shoreline. The bay had now become a central focus of the investigation, not because of evidence, but because that was where Scott claimed he had gone fishing on the day his wife vanished. In April 2003, nearly 4 months after Lacey had disappeared, a couple walking along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay made a gruesome discovery. The remains of a fetus had washed ashore, umbilical cord still attached. The very next day, a badly decomposed female torso was found a short distance away. Though headless and missing limbs, the body bore signs of advanced pregnancy. Dental records and DNA confirmed the worst fears. It was Lacey Peterson. The fetus was Connor. The discovery silenced any remaining doubts. This was no longer just a story about a missing person. It was now a confirmed homicide. And all roads, from Scott's odd behavior to his mysterious fishing trip, pointed in a singular direction. The final act of the story was about to begin. When the bodies of Lacey Peterson and her unborn child were recovered from the San Francisco Bay in mid-April 2003, the tragic mystery that had haunted the nation for months turned sharply into a criminal case. The discovery marked the final, devastating confirmation of what so many had feared. No longer a missing persons case, the investigation now became a search for justice. Within 4 days, authorities moved swiftly. Scott Peterson was arrested in La Jolla, San Diego, over 400 miles away from Modesto, near a golf course, driving a Mercedes-Benz registered to his mother. But what drew immediate concern wasn't just his location, but his appearance and the contents of the vehicle. His dark hair had been dyed blonde, and inside the car, officers found nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, camping gear, a shovel, a change of clothes, and his brother's identification. It was a portrait of a man seemingly prepared to run. Prosecutors argued that Scott was planning to flee, possibly to Mexico, in an attempt to avoid what was now an almost inevitable murder charge. On April 18, 2003, he was formally charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Lacey and one for Connor. He pleaded not guilty. The arrest sent a shockwave through the public, already emotionally saturated from 4 months of speculation. Now, the man once seen beside a grieving family was accused of orchestrating their devastation. The question on everyone's lips: why? The state's answer was blunt. Scott didn't want to be a husband or a father. The prosecution's narrative painted him as a man trapped in a life he no longer wanted, juggling financial strain, infidelity, and impending parenthood. With his mistress, Amber Fry, Now cooperating with investigators, prosecutors had a motive that was both chilling and tragically simple. Scott wanted out, but instead of divorce, he chose murder. As the legal machinery turned, preparations for the trial began to take shape. The case was instantly labeled a media circus. News trucks parked outside court buildings for months. Every movement of the Peterson family, and that of Lacey's parents, Sharon and Dennis Rocha, was followed, analyzed, and broadcast. The court of public opinion was in full session, and Scott's image was already poisoned by the revelations of his affair and lies. Yet, despite the tidal wave of suspicion, the prosecution still faced a daunting challenge. The case against Scott Peterson was entirely circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, no bloody crime scene. No forensic evidence tied him directly to the deaths of his wife and unborn child. The prosecution had to rely on a web of motives, behavior patterns, inconsistencies, and an overwhelming sense of guilt woven from circumstantial strands. They leaned heavily on Scott's repeated lies, to friends, to family, and most damningly, to Amber. Recordings of their conversations revealed Scott celebrating New Year's Eve with her just days after Lacey's disappearance, claiming to be in Paris while candlelight vigils were being held in Modesto. His apparent lack of grief, combined with his duplicity, was framed as evidence of a man who had already moved on emotionally because he had already acted physically. The trial was moved from Modesto to Redwood City, San Mateo County, due to intense media coverage and concerns about impartiality. Jury selection was complicated. Nearly everyone in the state, if not the country, had heard about the case. Still, after weeks of screening, a jury was assembled, and opening arguments began in June 2004. Prosecutor Rick DeStaso methodically laid out the state's case. Scott had planned the murder, disposed of the body at the marina, and crafted a cover story about fishing, which unraveled under scrutiny. The defense, led by attorney Mark Garagos, painted a very different picture. Garagos argued there was no physical evidence tying Scott to the crime. He claimed Lacey had likely been abducted by strangers, perhaps during a walk, and that the media had poisoned public perception beyond recovery. He suggested the bay was a large, accessible body of water, and the fact that the bodies were found nearby didn't prove Scott had dumped them there. He pointed to the lack of blood, lack of struggle, and the timeline inconsistencies in the prosecution's theory. But as testimony unfolded, a pattern emerged, one that didn't rely solely on physical evidence. Witness after witness described Scott's coldness, his avoidance of search efforts, and his bizarre behavior. Amber Fry took the stand, describing her relationship with Scott in heartbreaking detail, highlighting how he had maintained their affair even as the search for Lacey intensified. Her taped phone calls were played aloud in court. In them, Scott lied repeatedly, even assuring Amber he wanted to build a future with her, all while the rest of the world searched for his wife and child. The jury listened closely. Though Garagos tried to emphasize the absence of forensic proof, the emotional weight of the testimonies and recorded calls could not be ignored. Scott's version of events never evolved, never deepened in complexity, never showed a sincere urgency to find Lacey. The defense's theory, that someone else may have abducted her, lacked any supporting evidence or viable suspect. No signs of a break-in, no ransom demands, no DNA from unknown persons. It was a possibility but not a probability. As the weeks passed, the courtroom remained packed. Spectators lined up outside each morning, eager to witness the proceedings of a trial that had become emblematic of betrayal within domestic life. It wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story about how appearances could be deceiving, how behind suburban smiles and planned nursery rooms, darkness could fester quietly. And with each passing testimony, Scott's defense grew thinner. The weight of his lies, his detachment, and his elaborate deception with Amber formed the core of the state's argument. While prosecutors couldn't explain precisely how Lacey died, or provide the weapon, or pinpoint the moment of the crime, they didn't need to. They needed only to convince the jury that no one else had motive, means, and opportunity, and that Scott Peterson, with his growing disinterest in family life and his investment in another woman, had all three. The courtroom atmosphere darkened as the trial entered its final stretch. Closing arguments loomed. After months of public fascination, emotional exhaustion, and legal maneuvering, the time was nearing when 12 jurors would be asked to answer a single, life-altering question. Was Scott Peterson guilty of murdering his pregnant wife and their unborn son? The answer would not only determine the fate of one man, it would bring an end to a saga that had gripped an entire nation. As the trial approached its conclusion in the fall of 2004, the weight of months of evidence, testimony, and emotion settled over the Redwood City courtroom like a heavy fog. The prosecution, in their closing argument, did not offer theatrics. They simply urged the jury to consider the lies Scott Peterson told, not just to Amber Fry, but to everyone who loved Lacey. They asked the jurors to weigh his actions against what a grieving husband would do. No panic, no urgency, no genuine search for answers, only deception, calm manipulation, and silence. The defense, in contrast, held fast to the argument that without hard forensic evidence, no blood, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, the state could not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They insisted Scott's poor decisions and extramarital affair, while morally questionable, did not equate to murder. They warned the jury against being swept away by emotion and media frenzy. But the defense's narrative lacked weight. The emotional impact of Amber's calls, the eerie calmness of Scott in the wake of Lacey's disappearance, and the damning timing of events painted a picture too convincing to dismiss. Deliberations began on November 3, 2004. The jury, 9 women and 3 men, worked quietly but intently. Though they initially expressed some confusion about the timeline and evidence, they returned a verdict 11 days later. On November 12, the courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood. The words were final. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. Audible gasps echoed through the room. Outside, crowds erupted, some in cheers, others in quiet mourning for the family's irreversible loss. The sentencing phase followed in December. Jurors heard victim impact statements from Lacey's family, including her mother, Sharon Rocha, who described the agony of losing a daughter and grandson in one breath. She spoke directly to Scott, her former son-in-law, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. In that moment, years of grief and rage poured out in the hope that justice, if not healing, might follow. On December 13, 2004, the jury recommended the death penalty. A month later, the judge upheld their recommendation and sentenced Scott Peterson to die by lethal injection. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he would remain in legal limbo for years to come. The case did not simply end with the verdict. It left behind a storm of questions about trust, media coverage, and the public's fascination with domestic tragedy. Scott's legal team filed appeals. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence due to jury selection errors, though his conviction was upheld. And in 2021, he was formally resentenced to life in prison without parole. Still, he has maintained his innocence. But to many, the verdict was never in doubt. The face Scott Peterson once showed to the world, the doting husband, the soon-to-be father, had been forever dismantled. In its place remained the haunting image of a man who had carefully erased a life he had once promised to protect. The Peterson case remains one of the most devastating reminders that sometimes the darkest crimes happen not in the shadows. She was taken from her bed at knife point while her sister watched, frozen in terror. For 9 months, the world searched, unaware she was hidden in plain sight, disguised and abused. The truth behind Elizabeth Smart's abduction is more disturbing than fiction, and her escape, more powerful than anyone imagined. On the night of June 4, 2002, the Smart household in Salt Lake City, Utah was calm. Elizabeth Smart, just 14 years old, had gone to bed like any other school night, sharing her room with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. The suburban home, nestled in a quiet, well-off neighborhood, was the picture of safety. But safety shattered in the early hours of June 5. A man slipped through an unlocked window, a knife in hand, and crept silently into the girl's bedroom. He leaned over Elizabeth's bed and whispered that if she made a sound, he would kill her family. Frozen in fear, Mary Catherine pretended to sleep as she watched the stranger coax Elizabeth out of bed and into the darkness. It was a brazen and intimate crime, a child taken from her own home, while her family slept just feet away. The next morning was chaos. Elizabeth's family awoke to find her gone without a trace. Her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, were shattered. The police arrived within minutes, and within hours, their house became a base for search and rescue. Local media broadcast the news before noon. Flyers with Elizabeth's face appeared across the city by the end of the day. Helicopters searched the hillsides. Neighbors, friends, and complete strangers joined the effort. It was one of the largest manhunts Utah had ever seen. But despite the urgency, leads were scarce. Investigators pursued multiple possibilities: runaway, family involvement, even school acquaintances. The idea of a home invasion abduction seemed improbable in such a tight-knit, secure neighborhood. Yet, Mary Catherine's testimony slowly began to shape the investigation. Initially too traumatized to speak clearly, she later recalled that the abductor's voice sounded familiar, like someone her family had once hired for a day job. She couldn't remember his name but believed he had gone by Emmanuel. The name Emmanuel struck a chord with Lois Smart. Months earlier, she had briefly hired a homeless man who went by that name to help with roof repairs. He was older, with a long beard and a strange, preachy tone. At the time, he hadn't seemed threatening, just a wandering man who quoted scripture. Now, he became a suspect. Unfortunately, the Smart family hadn't recorded his last name or any other information, making him incredibly difficult to track down. Police began combing shelters, soup kitchens, and downtown streets, looking for a bearded preacher who called himself Emmanuel. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had been taken deep into the Wasatch Mountains, a remote area just a few miles from her home but far enough to be hidden. Her captor, Brian David Mitchell, also known as Emmanuel, was a self-proclaimed prophet who believed he was called by God to take multiple wives. His wife and accomplice, Wanda Barzee, awaited them at a hidden campsite. There, in a crude tent constructed with tarps and branches, Elizabeth's nightmare began. Within hours of her abduction, Elizabeth was forced into a bizarre religious marriage ceremony. Mitchell, quoting scripture and mumbling divine justification, declared her his wife. Barzee stood by, assisting and echoing his delusions. That night, and nearly every night for the next 9 months, Mitchell raped Elizabeth repeatedly, claiming it was his duty and divine right. She was starved, drugged with alcohol, silenced through fear, and physically restrained. Dressed in long robes and a veil, she became invisible to the outside world. Back in Salt Lake City, the Smart family remained in the public eye. Their pleas for Elizabeth's safe return were broadcast nationally. Ed Smart appeared on talk shows, urging the kidnapper to show mercy. They worked closely with law enforcement, although frustration grew with the lack of results. Skepticism from some in the public and media began to mount. A few even speculated about the family's involvement. Despite their pain, the Smarts remained determined, using every tool available to keep Elizabeth's face and story in the spotlight. During this time, Elizabeth was isolated from the world. Mitchell kept her bound or confined, often in extreme heat or cold, and always under the watch of Barzee. Days blurred together in a haze of abuse and forced prayers. When they moved from place to place, Elizabeth was hidden under layers of clothing, her face veiled, her identity erased. Yet she survived. She memorized details of the places they went, tried to track time, and looked for ways to maintain her sanity. Eventually, the group relocated to California, setting up a tent city behind a church and blending into the growing population of the homeless and mentally ill. Mitchell preached on street corners and wandered neighborhoods, while Barzee begged for food or money. Elizabeth, disguised in thick robes and head coverings, was almost unrecognizable. Even when walking through populated areas, no one questioned her identity. Fear, shame, and constant manipulation silenced her voice. Back home, Mary Catherine's memory became a turning point. One night, months after the abduction, She sat down with a sketch artist and helped refine a composite image of Emmanuel. When it was released publicly in early 2003, tips began flooding in. Many who had seen Mitchell preaching on the streets called the hotline, claiming the man in the sketch looked familiar. His photo began circulating across news outlets. Authorities, reinvigorated by the renewed attention, began narrowing their search. What followed was a story of luck meeting perseverance, one that would soon bring Elizabeth Smart back from the shadows. By early 2003, nearly 9 months had passed since Elizabeth Smart had vanished. The emotional weight on the Smart family was immeasurable. Though the massive public campaign had kept her case alive in national headlines, hope was beginning to wear thin. Yet, behind the scenes, a critical breakthrough was quietly forming. Mary Catherine's recollection that the abductor's voice sounded like a man called Emmanuel had finally borne fruit. With the public release of a newly refined police sketch, drawn from Mary Catherine's memory and enhanced by forensic artists, the public eye shifted. The image bore a striking resemblance to a man seen on the streets of Salt Lake City, a man who preached with a Bible in hand and a wild, messianic look in his eyes. Tips flooded the police hotline. Among them were several individuals who recognized Emmanuel as Brian David Mitchell, a self-proclaimed prophet who often wandered Utah's streets in long robes, quoting scripture and warning of God's wrath. Police began piecing together his history. A former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who had spiraled into radical delusions after years of homelessness, drug use, and religious obsession. He believed himself to be chosen by God to rebuild the church in its purest form, beginning by collecting wives. His first follower was Wanda Barzee, a woman with a troubled past, who had become both his spiritual disciple and his wife. While Mitchell and Barzee believed they were living out a divine mission, Elizabeth remained their captive, her life reduced to daily survival. In the crude shelters they built, first in Utah's foothills, later behind churches and in wooded campsites, Elizabeth was subjected to relentless psychological torment. Her captors alternated between scripture-laced justifications for their actions and intense paranoia about being discovered. Any expression of resistance from her was met with threats, starvation, or verbal punishment disguised as spiritual correction. Their movements remained erratic. They migrated between camps, sometimes sleeping beneath tarps in the snow, other times lurking near urban areas. Despite Elizabeth's heavy disguise, a gray wig, a veil, layers of filthy clothing, there were moments when she was in public. Once, Mitchell took her to a public library. Another time they were seen walking near a grocery store. But even when Elizabeth was just feet away from help, the mental conditioning and overwhelming fear kept her silent. Mitchell constantly reminded her that if she spoke or tried to run, he would kill her and her family. The fear was paralyzing, and it worked. Then, in March 2003, Mitchell made a reckless decision. He believed God was instructing him to return to Salt Lake City to find more followers. They had been living in California for several months, and Mitchell felt his mission was stagnating. Against Barzee's objections, they packed up what little they had and boarded a Greyhound bus back to Utah. Elizabeth, still heavily veiled and compliant, had no say. Her hands were rarely bound in public anymore. Mitchell trusted that her silence was guaranteed by fear. Back in Utah, they settled temporarily in the Sandy area, a suburban town south of Salt Lake City. Mitchell, as always, was drawn to street preaching, and one afternoon on March 12, 2003, he made a mistake that would change everything. Walking down State Street with Barzee and Elizabeth at his side, he was approached by police officers. Someone had seen the sketch on television and called in a tip. The description matched the trio exactly, especially the man in robes with 2 women trailing behind him. Police officers questioned Mitchell, who gave them a false name. Elizabeth, her face mostly hidden beneath a veil, stood silently beside him. They asked her for her name, but she didn't respond. Mitchell answered for her, but something felt off to the officers. One of them noticed the girl's eyes. Despite the layers of clothing and her frail appearance, there was something familiar in her gaze. They pressed again, softly. "Is your name Elizabeth Smart?" There was a pause. The girl's lips trembled. Then she whispered, Yes. The officers quickly separated her from Mitchell and Barzy. Within minutes, Elizabeth Smart was in protective custody. Word spread fast. By the time her parents received the phone call, reporters were already gathering outside their home. When Ed and Lois Smart arrived at the police station, their daughter, frail, pale, but alive, was waiting for them. The reunion was tearful, surreal, and profoundly emotional. 9 months of terror had ended in an instant. The media reaction was immediate and explosive. News outlets across the country interrupted programming to report the miraculous recovery. Reporters camped outside the Smart home for days. The case that had gripped a nation now concluded with the most unexpected outcome: the return of a missing child after nearly a year in captivity. While the world celebrated, investigators quickly shifted their focus to building a case against Mitchell and Barzy. Both were arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping, sexual assault, and multiple other crimes. Barzy was silent during initial interrogations, while Mitchell ranted about divine authority and his prophetic mission. He was erratic, incoherent, and refused to acknowledge the legal system as valid. His behavior during hearings included spontaneous singing, scriptural recitation, and refusals to cooperate. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate his mental state. Elizabeth, in the meantime, began the long process of healing. Reintegrating into family life was not simple. Her ordeal had changed her profoundly, but she remained composed. Her family, determined to protect her privacy, issued limited statements and refused to allow her to be re-victimized in the public eye. Investigators were stunned by Elizabeth's memory. Despite her trauma, she was able to recount events, timelines, and locations with astonishing detail, testimony that would later prove critical in court. But the legal road ahead was anything but simple. Mitchell's mental competency became a legal battlefield, delaying proceedings for years. Barzy, on the other hand, pled guilty to lesser charges in exchange for her testimony and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mitchell, however, was deemed incompetent multiple times, leading to frustration among the Smart family and the public. The question loomed: would justice ever be fully served? The nation had its miracle, but the final chapter of the case was still unfolding, and Elizabeth Smart's next steps would help define what survival, resilience, and justice truly looked like. With Elizabeth Smart safely reunited with her family, the focus turned to what many believed would be the final step: justice. But prosecuting Brian David Mitchell proved to be far more complex than expected. From the outset, Mitchell refused to participate in court proceedings in any rational way. He sang hymns loudly in court, shouted biblical verses, and declared himself a prophet above the law. Time and again, his erratic behavior forced the court to halt proceedings and order psychological evaluations. It quickly became clear that the legal system was not dealing with a straightforward criminal. It was dealing with a man whose insanity defense would stall the process for years. As psychiatrists examined Mitchell, opinions remained divided. Some believed he was delusional but competent to stand trial, while others concluded he was so mentally disturbed that he could not understand the charges against him. The court proceedings became an exhausting loop. A hearing, followed by another evaluation, followed by more delays. For the Smart family, it was a torturous extension of their nightmare. Elizabeth had survived the physical horror, but the justice system was now dragging her through a psychological one. Wanda Barzi's case, meanwhile, moved more swiftly. Facing the weight of evidence and public outrage, she accepted a plea deal. Her guilty plea included charges of aiding and abetting kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with credit for time already served. The deal required her to testify against Mitchell when the time came. She also underwent psychiatric evaluation but was ultimately deemed competent to accept her sentence. Despite her role in Elizabeth's suffering, her plea bargain ensured a much lighter sentence than many expected. As Mitchell remained in legal limbo, Elizabeth refused to be silenced. She could have chosen anonymity to retreat and live in peace, but instead, she stepped forward. At just 18 years old, she began speaking publicly about her ordeal. Not in sensational terms, but with quiet strength and clear purpose. She advocated for legislation aimed at protecting children from predators, improving Amber Alert systems, and supporting victim recovery. Her poise astonished the public. People saw not just a survivor but a leader. Years passed. In 2008, federal prosecutors took over the case against Mitchell. Unlike the state proceedings, the federal court moved more assertively. After yet another round of evaluations, a judge ruled that Mitchell was indeed competent to stand trial. Prosecutors argued that Mitchell's bizarre courtroom behavior was calculated, a manipulation to avoid accountability. Elizabeth herself testified during a pretrial hearing, confronting Mitchell directly for the first time in years. In a calm and unwavering voice, she described the months of abuse, the mind games, the threats, and the way he used religion as a weapon. In November 2010, the federal trial finally began in Salt Lake City. Elizabeth Smart, now 23, took the stand once again. In front of a packed courtroom, she recounted the chilling details of her captivity. Her testimony lasted several days, each word reinforcing the undeniable truth of Mitchell's guilt. She described how he justified rape with scripture, how he beat her if she defied him, how he silenced her with threats against her family. Her courage in that courtroom left a profound impact, not just on the jury, but on the country watching. The defense claimed Mitchell was insane, that he truly believed he was acting under divine command. But prosecutors skillfully dismantled that argument, showing how Mitchell concealed his crimes, manipulated others, and avoided detection, all signs of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The jury deliberated for just 5 hours. On December 10, 2010, Brian David Mitchell was found guilty on all counts. The following May, he was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He would never be free again. For Elizabeth and her family, justice had finally been served, 8 years after the crime. Barzy, however, would remain a troubling footnote. In 2018, to the shock of the Smart family and the public, she was released from prison. The federal board determined she had served her sentence, including credit for time in state custody. Elizabeth spoke out forcefully, questioning how someone so complicit in her suffering could be released with so little warning. Still, she used the moment to renew her advocacy, pushing for greater transparency and victim notification laws in parole systems. In the years following the trial, Elizabeth Smart transformed tragedy into purpose. She wrote a best-selling memoir, My Story, which detailed her kidnapping and recovery. She became a regular voice in national media on issues of child safety and abuse recovery. She worked closely with organizations to promote education about grooming, abduction, and recovery, even founding the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. Through it, she launched initiatives to help survivors of trafficking and abuse reclaim their lives. She also helped produce a documentary about her experience, allowing her story to reach a broader audience in her own words. Rather than sensationalizing her trauma, the documentary highlighted her strength, her healing, and her mission to help others. She spoke about forgiveness not as an obligation, but as a personal release from the pain that others tried to define her by. Today, Elizabeth Smart is not remembered as a victim, but as a force of resilience and advocacy. She married in 2012, started a family, and continued to speak openly about both the darkness she survived and the light she chose to follow. Her voice remains a lifeline for countless survivors who are still finding their way out of silence and shame. The case of Elizabeth Smart isn't just the story of a kidnapping. It's a mirror reflecting some of the most painful realities in society: mental illness, religious extremism, legal loopholes, and the long journey of trauma recovery. But it's also a powerful testament to survival. It shows what happens when a community refuses to give up, when a family never stops believing, and when one young girl refuses to be broken. Even in its most horrifying chapters, the Elizabeth Smart story is a reminder that from unspeakable darkness, a new beginning is still possible. Not every ending is a rescue, but in this case, the world watched a child stolen for 22 days in 2002. Fear gripped the nation as random victims were gunned down without warning. No pattern, no mercy, just a sniper's bullet from nowhere. What turned a teenager into an assassin, and a father into a terrorist. The truth behind the DC sniper attacks will shatter your assumptions. As dusk settled over the Washington, D.C. suburbs on October 2, 2002, the world shifted without warning. A gunshot cracked the calm outside a grocery store in Wheaton, Maryland, killing 55-year-old James Martin. It was a clean shot, swift, precise, and silent in its aftermath. There was no suspect, no getaway vehicle, no one who even saw the barrel of a gun. Martin had been running errands, just like everyone else that evening, completely unaware he'd become the first casualty of a killing spree that would soon grip the nation in paralyzing dread. The following morning delivered chaos. In less than 16 hours, 5 more people were dead, gunned down in broad daylight across Montgomery County. The randomness was horrifying. One was shot while mowing grass. Another was hit while sitting on a bench. A woman was killed as she loaded groceries into her car. No warning, no witnesses, and no connection between victims. The police were stunned. These weren't targeted murders. They were executions, cold, calculated, and designed to send a message. But what message, and from whom? A wave of fear unlike anything since 9/11 swept through the capital region. Suddenly, daily tasks became acts of courage. Schools canceled recess, parents clung to their children, and adults hesitated before stepping out of their homes. Gas stations became scenes of frantic desperation. People ducked behind car doors while filling their tanks. Others scanned rooftops and treelines. Law enforcement was thrown into the national spotlight. Chief Charles Moose, the face of the Montgomery County Police Department, stepped into an impossible role. He had to calm a city that felt like prey, without any answers to offer. The fear was amplified by the shooter's invisibility. No one saw the killer. There were no shell casings left behind, no clear vantage points, no distinct method beyond the terrifying randomness. Surveillance footage offered nothing. Ballistic analysis confirmed a high-powered rifle was used, but that only narrowed the scope so much. A task force was assembled quickly, involving FBI, ATF, and local jurisdictions, but the killers always stayed one shot ahead. And then, almost as if mocking their efforts, the pattern shifted. Days would pass with no incident. Then another shot would ring out. One more life ended, and the cycle restarted. Investigators couldn't publicly admit it, but they were dealing with a nightmare scenario. A sniper on the loose, mobile, unpredictable, and perhaps worse, strategic. With every killing, the shooters proved more methodical. They seemed to study the terrain, pick ideal locations, time their shots for maximum shock. The psychological warfare was just as potent as the bullets themselves. What made the case uniquely chilling was the sense that anyone could be next. Victims varied in age, race, and occupation. There was no demographic pattern to profile. The killers were not selecting targets. They were choosing moments. Then came the cryptic messages. A tarot card, left near one scene, read, "Call me God." At another crime scene, a note demanded money and threatened children. One line stood out with sinister clarity. "Your children are not safe anywhere at any time." It was no longer just fear. It was taunting, manipulative, and deliberate. Whoever was behind the attacks didn't just want to kill. They wanted to control, to paralyze a region emotionally and psychologically. Schools tightened security further. Outdoor activities were canceled altogether. Public trust in law enforcement's ability to protect crumbled with each unanswered attack. Despite the growing pressure, the investigation struggled to break through. Hundreds of tips poured in daily, most leading nowhere. Media coverage grew relentless, with anchors broadcasting live from crime scenes, analyzing every scrap of information. Talk radio flooded with theories, some blaming terrorists, others suggesting military-trained killers or white supremacists. For weeks, the public speculated about a lone gunman hidden in the shadows, unaware that the truth was far more unsettling. There were 2 of them, and they were hiding in plain sight. The shooter's weapon was a Bushmaster XM-15, a civilian version of the military's M16. It was accurate, powerful, and lethal from great distances. But what made it deadly wasn't just the rifle, it was the platform. A blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, unassuming and common, had been retrofitted into a mobile killing machine. A hole had been drilled into the trunk, just above the license plate, allowing the shooter to lie prone inside and fire with near-perfect concealment. From a distance, it looked like any other car in traffic, parked on the roadside or idling in a lot. No one suspected it was a weapon. As the killings continued, so did the speculation. The FBI created behavioral profiles suggesting a disgruntled white male acting alone. Police set up checkpoints, scanned rooftops, and even monitored local gun shops. Yet the killers avoided every trap, exploited every blind spot, and remained mobile. Their ability to strike and vanish without pattern, motive, or identity made them seem almost supernatural. Every effort to pin them down collapsed under the weight of their invisibility. The terror spread beyond the D.C. area, rippling into neighboring states, and even across the country as Americans watched in horror, wondering if their cities were next. Law enforcement desperately needed a break. But every forensic lead hit a dead end. The shell casings had been wiped clean. The scenes were pristine. Even witnesses who thought they saw something remembered nothing useful. The killers seemed to plan everything in advance: routes, exits, distances, like they were conducting a guerrilla war against an entire population. And in some ways, they were. This was no ordinary murder spree. It was methodical, deliberate domestic terrorism. And the people behind it had more than a body count in mind. The public, meanwhile, was at a breaking point. Life had become a series of anxious calculations. Should I pump gas now or wait until dark? Is the grocery store safe? Parents questioned whether to send their children to school. The entire region was locked in a psychological chokehold, unsure whether the next day would bring another press briefing, another victim, or maybe, just maybe, a clue. As the community tried to piece itself back together, the investigation transitioned into prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming, the fear still raw. People struggled to process the randomness, the evil, the months of fear they had lived through. News anchors used the term domestic terrorism again and again, and for once, there was no debate. These weren't just crimes, they were acts of war waged from the trunk of a car. As the investigation shifted to the courtroom, what remained wasn't just a trail of victims, but a nation desperate for closure. The arrest had ended the bloodshed, but the emotional wreckage lingered. Survivors and victims' families faced a new chapter, one of reliving the horror through trial proceedings, media attention, and public speculation. Prosecutors now carried the burden of translating overwhelming evidence into a narrative that would not only convict but explain. They were dealing with a case that had no precedent, one where calculated terror had merged with a twisted personal agenda, leaving a scar far deeper than physical wounds. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were tried separately. Muhammad's trial was the first, and it became a national spectacle. Prosecutors argued that he was not just a murderer, but a terrorist who used fear as a psychological weapon. The key piece of evidence, the blue Chevrolet Caprice, rigged like a sniper's nest, was rolled into the courtroom for the jury to see firsthand. For the public, it was a jarring moment, a reminder of how something so ordinary had hidden something so monstrous. Jurors listened to ballistic experts explain how the Bushmaster rifle matched bullets from the murders. Phone records and letters linked Muhammad to the extortion attempts. Witnesses described his erratic behavior, his fixation on violence, and his increasing detachment from reality. What proved most chilling, however, were the tapes and writings uncovered from Muhammad's personal belongings. They revealed his delusional belief that he could spark a revolution, some twisted crusade against a corrupt system that he blamed for the loss of his children and his own identity. It was less about ideology than it was about rage. The courtroom saw a man who had weaponized his personal failures into mass murder. The jury took little time in deciding. John Allen Muhammad was found guilty and sentenced to death. In 2009, he was executed by lethal injection, his final moments silent, as the families of his victims watched from behind a glass partition. Lee Boyd Malvo's trial brought a different kind of reckoning. Just 17 years old during the attacks, his youth complicated the legal questions. The defense painted a picture of manipulation and abuse. Malvo, they argued, had been indoctrinated, brainwashed by Muhammad. He had no father, no home, no identity until he met the man who taught him how to kill. The jury was shown drawings and journal entries from Malvo that reflected his psychological state. Cold, detached, yet confused. He had referred to himself as a monster, describing in detail the killings and showing signs of guilt mixed with devotion. Forensic psychologists testified that Malvo had been groomed, isolated, and reprogrammed. He wasn't born a killer, he had been made into one. Yet despite the testimony, the facts remained. Malvo had pulled the trigger more than once. He had participated willingly in a series of premeditated killings that had terrorized an entire region. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over time, he expressed deep remorse, offering apologies in interviews and acknowledging the destruction he had caused. In the years that followed, legal challenges were raised due to his age at the time of the crimes, with courts reconsidering whether life without parole for juvenile offenders was constitutional. But for many of the families impacted, no legal shift could change the past. Whether manipulated or not, Malvo had been a participant in their worst nightmares. The DC sniper case left a legacy that went beyond courtrooms and convictions. It altered the way law enforcement handled mass shootings, long-range attacks, and coordinated domestic threats. It revealed the limitations of traditional profiling, how the entire country had been looking for a white man in a van, while two black males drove freely in a sedan. It exposed the gaps in communication between agencies, as clues and connections in earlier shootings had been overlooked. After the case, there was a renewed push for better information sharing across jurisdictions, improved surveillance tactics, and a deeper understanding of how domestic terrorism could arise not just from ideology, but from personal despair and radicalization. For ordinary citizens, the trauma lingered long after the headlines faded. Children who grew up diving behind cars at gas stations carried that fear into adulthood. Teachers remembered locking doors and huddling students into hallways, while parents drove erratically through parking lots, zigzagging to avoid being an easy target. Even the simple act of pumping gas had, for weeks, become an exercise in survival. For a generation of Americans in the DC area, October 2002 would always remain a scar on memory, a time when every shadow looked like danger, and death came silently from 100 yards away. The psychological grip of the case inspired films, books, documentaries, and academic studies. It was dissected in criminology courses, cited in discussions on youth radicalization, and used to examine the long-term consequences of trauma. Yet no amount of analysis could fully account for the randomness of it all, how lives were ended not because of personal conflict, but because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The human cost was not just in the body count, but in the invisible weight of living under siege. Years later, as society grappled with new waves of mass violence, the sniper case remained a haunting blueprint. It showed how two individuals armed with a rifle and a plan could paralyze a nation through fear alone, and how sometimes the most devastating attacks come not from organizations or conspiracies, but from broken people with just enough rage, training, and time to cause unimaginable harm. The blue Chevy Caprice now rests in a museum, a chilling exhibit of what was once a vehicle of terror. Behind its windows and rusted frame are the echoes of victims' final moments and a reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight. Survivors continue to speak at memorials and educational forums, ensuring that the pain they carry helps prevent others from living through the same nightmare. In the end, the DC sniper attacks were not just a true crime story, they were a national trauma. They forced a reckoning with how fear spreads, how manipulation corrodes innocence, and how a society must confront not only what happened, but why it was allowed to happen. The streets of DC eventually returned to normal, schools reopened, and people walked through parking lots without flinching. But for those who lived through October 2002, normal was never quite the same again.